Welcome to this third Peace Talks Policy and Research event. Today, we are going to discuss with academic researchers, but as well field experts, about the relationship between social media and hate crimes and violence, real-world violence. As usual, we are going to start with a presentation by a scholar about his research on social media and hate crime, with two examples from Germany and the US, and more specifically about the tweets from Donald Trump and how it relates to hate crimes against Muslims in the US. Then, with our panel of experts, we are going to discuss about those findings, think about real-world applications, policy recommendation, other situations and other examples, for example, Myanmar or Tunisia or different places and time in the world where similar situations happened. Together, we are going to discuss about the positive sides, but also the negative sides of social media, the different possibilities of policies to reduce violence induced by the use of social media, but also if it's possible in real world, in different situations, in conflict situation, in the developing world. Is it always a good policy, or what those experts think about censorship, for example, about Donald Trump, and all those very big questions. What is the importance given to private companies as Twitter to decide what we can see and what we can't? But also we are going to discuss about echo chambers, the fact that on social media you tend to see only things that reinforce your view of the world, your behavior, and your opinion. To do so, we are going to start with Carlo Schwarz, professor of economics at Bocconi University, with a very impressive publication record with publication in very top economics journals. He's going to start presenting his research on social media and hate crime. Then we are going to get inputs from Adam Cooper, who oversees digital conflict at the Humanitarian Dialogue Center, the oldest private diplomacy organization in the world. Adam also ran negotiation operations in Myanmar and Asia for more than 10 years and has a very good applied knowledge and field expertise. Then Marina Petrova will also share her insights. She's a postdoc researcher at Bocconi University in political science, with expertise in political violence and conflict processes. And finally, our panel will be completed by Milena Juhelova, who is a PhD candidate at the University Pompeu Fabra and who is doing research specifically on violence and social media.
So it's great to have the opportunity to talk about this very interesting question, and I'm very hopeful in the discussion we might also be able to address some of the concerns and maybe come up with some possible solutions to this problem we are facing. Just maybe as a motivation, I think, given that you have decided to attend this presentation, I think it doesn't come as a surprise that in recent years we have seen increasing concerns about the amount of hateful content that is circulating online, particularly on social media platforms, whether Twitter, Facebook, or even other social media networks that are more popular, for example, in Asia or in Russia. And people have wondered whether this behavior that we see online also has any real world ramifications. And as a motivation, talking or basically looking back at the existing research we have for traditional media platforms. And here I just want to give a very terse overview over the existing work, which by no means is exhaustive. So if your favorite paper is not cited here, basically, please forgive me. But we already have evidence for a link between a lot of traditional media platforms and violence. So for example, Ardena et al. Looks at the radio and anti-Semitic propaganda during the Third Reich in Germany and finds that this is linked to pogroms against the Jews in more exposed areas. When we look at Dale de la Vigna, they look, basically that's a typo, basically they look actually at violent crime in the aftermath of violent movie releases in the US and find a connection. Cart and Dahl, they look at basically domestic violence after upset losses of some football teams and also find a connection to domestic violence. And lastly, just to also cover more modern media platforms, when we look at the broadband internet, Buller et al. Investigated these and found that at least in Scandinavia, the broadband internet rollout was associated with increases in sex crime. So for all these traditional platforms, we really see a connection, or basically at least we have evidence that what you see and what happens on these media platforms seems to play a role and can influence real world behavior. And that's the main reason why basically people are very much interested in studying these media platforms. But when it came to social media, the evidence, at least when we started our projects more than 4 years ago now, the evidence was far more scant. And this was one of the gaps me and my co-author tried to fill with our research. And in today's presentation, in the 40 minutes I have, I will try to give you an overview over the 2 research projects we have done and the 2 different case studies. So in the first part of the presentation, I want to talk about our project on the connection between Facebook and anti-refugee speech on Facebook and anti-refugee hate crime in Germany during the height of the refugee crisis in the years from 2015 to 2017. And in the second part, then we will switch over to the other side of the Atlantic and look at the impact of Donald Trump and his divisive rhetoric on Twitter on hate crimes against Muslims in the United States. And here, obviously, we're going to focus on the social media network Twitter. And as you will see, even though we are focusing on 2 different countries, 2 different social media platforms, completely different, basically, political parties, we're going to look at the impact of these social media platforms on hate crime is visible in both cases. And hopefully by the end of the presentation, I will be able to convince you that there indeed seems to be a connection between the exposure to social media and hate crime. So to get started with the first case study in Germany, just in case, so you have the opportunity to also look up the paper in case you want to have more details, and I will be able to cover in my short presentation here. The paper is called Fanning the Flames of Hate, Social Media and Hate Crime, and as already mentioned is a course at work with Carsten Müller, who's currently still at Princeton University and will switch to the National University of Singapore from next year onwards. So here, maybe to give you as a start, a brief introduction to our data. Given that we want to study anti-refugee hate crime, it doesn't come as a surprise that we need data on these, and our data in this fact were collected by the Amadeo Antonio Foundation, which went through the effort of collecting information on anti-refugee incidents, as Germany does not, as of now, collect basically information on hate crime in any way, shape, or form that are publicly available. And the information we have covers 3,335 incidents from 2015 until the beginning of 2017. And overall, we have a lot of cases of property damage, over 2,000 in fact, but we also have over 500 cases of outright assault against refugees and over 200 cases of arson. And the map I showed you in the outline is in fact each dot you see in this map marks the location of an anti-refugee incident in Germany. And basically you see how widespread these incidents were over the entirety of the Federal Republic. And what the shading of the municipalities in the background indicates is the amount of Facebook usage of the web page of the Facebook page of the Alternative for Germany. So for those of you not familiar with the German context, the Alternative for Germany is a far-right party which clearly positioned itself against refugees And basically, it's probably the most important far-right platform for the exchange of these type of ideas. The Alternative for Germany also at the time when we started our project had the strongest Facebook presence of any party in Germany, even so its vote share lagged behind many of other major parties. And what made the AfD Facebook page also particularly interesting for us was not only the stance of the party, but that the AfD also freely allowed their users to post comments, as you can see on here on the right hand side. And of course also the AfD, as in usual Facebook fashion, allowed to like and share and basically post your own comments there. And maybe just to give you a brief idea of the type of comments you can find about refugees on this page, one of the users, for example, posted, maybe there's a plot for German Jews to be exterminated by the large stream of refugees, but what could be the reason? World War II. And it's really basically really flaunting the far-right general replacement theory here, which has been like a far-right conspiracy theory for a long time, and directly linking it to basically the inflow of refugees in Germany during the refugee crisis. And what we started with in our analysis is we just compared the amount of anti-refugee comments on posts we observe on the AfD page and compared them to the amount of anti-refugee attacks you see in each given week in our observation period. And this is what you can see in the following graph. And basically, on the one hand, you see that, of course, the sentiment against refugees we observe on the page clearly reacts to major events of the refugee crisis. So whether it is Merkel's basically "we can do it" speech, basically the sexual assaults that happened in Cologne in the New Year's Eve night, or a terrorist attack that basically was committed by refugees in Germany, and basically each of these events is associated with a huge spike. And we can also see that there seems to be some correlation between the anti-refugee sentiment on social media and the number of anti-refugee incidents. But just looking at this graph, it is impossible to say whether there's any connection between the two, particularly looking here at the middle of the graph. Even so, also the sentiment clearly spikes. Basically, the peaks are slightly misaligned here. So it is hard to tell what is leading what. There might be concerns about reverse causality. And this is very much what we are trying to address in our approach. So what we then did first is we basically now we are going to look at the German-wide anti-refugee sentiment, and we are now going to compare whether municipalities with high and low Facebook usage behave differently. So the idea here is simply that if the sentiment is indeed propagating through social media, in particular the Facebook network, we of course would expect a stronger connection in municipalities with higher Facebook usage. And this is easily confirmed just doing a bin scatter plot, where on the left-hand side, we show the relationship between the anti-refugee sentiment on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, you have the probability of an anti-refugee incident per municipality and week. So basically, to give you an idea, so a 1% probability would mean that in 100 municipalities, and in Germany, basically at least in the municipalities we are looking at, we are talking about slightly over 4,000 municipalities. So it means for every 100 municipalities, we would observe one anti-refugee incident. And on the right-hand side, we reproduce the same graph, but here now for municipalities with below average, basically usage of this far-right Facebook page. And I think it doesn't need much explanation here. This relationship between the online sentiment and the offline violence is far stronger for the municipalities with more users of this far-right Facebook page, which is basically what you would have expected. The concern, of course, with this finding is that since we are looking at this far-right Facebook page, and even so we can control for a lot of local confounders, you might be concerned that that these municipalities would have behaved differently even in the absence of these Facebook exposure, and that is just basically the far-right attitudes in these municipalities that can explain this pattern in the data. So to really then get at the effect of social media and really nail it down that we are really talking about an online phenomenon and that online exposure seems to matter here, we are exploiting the fact that in Germany, there are quite a few internet outages occurring from time to time. And we have collected data on internet outages for our observation period. And we are particularly going to focus on longer lasting internet outages that result from damage to the internet infrastructure. And basically, we are focusing on internet outages that last at least a day. And what we're then going to do is now we are going to compare areas with the same amount of Facebook usage. And we are, of course, also going to take other observable characteristics into account. And we're now going to compare these counties and analyze what happens if basically one municipality is cut off from the internet due to due to an outage and therefore is not exposed to these online sentiments anymore. And basically the main result of the paper is then visualized in the following graph. This graph is basically the black dots are more or less identical to the ones you saw on the previous graph. What we have now split out as these gray dots is now municipalities that are cut off from the internet due to an internet outage. And what we observe then is basically this stunning pattern, at least to me and my co-author, that while if you have internet access, your municipality strongly reacts to the amount of anti-refugee content online. But if you are cut off from the internet, this relationship completely disappears and this line is flat, indicating that basically without the exposure to this online content, there does not seem to be the relationship. And this is probably what most strongly speaks to the connection and the importance of Facebook. We of course have done several validation checks for this result. Just to give you an idea, we can show that this effect we are observing for internet outages is indeed concentrated in the week where we observe the outage, and we find nothing before and after. And in case you're wondering, we might spuriously pick up an effect of the internet and not of Facebook, we can repeat our analysis looking at Germany-wide Facebook outages. And here we see a very similar pattern, also that in weeks of major Facebook outages, basically municipalities with low and high Facebook usage behave relatively similarly. But what I now want to do, maybe just to also highlight a few things about social media and the particular case in Germany, basically is to highlight a few major differences between traditional media platforms, which already have been studied, and like these new social media platforms, and why we may particularly should be worried about basically the social media platforms. On the one hand, basically, given that users are able to create their own content on these far-right Facebook pages, we see that the share of refugee, and in this case particularly anti-refugee content, is significantly higher than what would you see in any traditional German media outlet. So here we plot these shares over time. So also while during the refugee crisis, we see that around 8% of the reports in traditional news media are about refugees. This share is significantly higher on the AfD page, peaking around, basically at around 17%. So indicating that at the time where we see these really strong tensions, if you go to the AfD page, every fifth post will mention refugees in some way, shape, or form. And as we show in our next analysis, also the language used to describe refugee posts, or basically refugees, is significantly more negative on the AfD page. Not only are refugees more often linked to crime, also there's a lot of distrust expressed towards the political elites, and also towards the press. So to give you an idea, what we have done here is just looking at the relative probabilities, so which words appear more frequently in the AfD page than relative to newspapers. So if you look at words that contain like the stem refugee, we find words like refugee lie, refugee insanity, refugee mafia, and the same basically when it comes to the mentions of basically the folk, so people in German, we really see like that betrayal of the people, hostile to the people. We have this feeling that basically the people are betrayed by the media as well as the political elites. And if you look at crime, of course, we also see a lot of mentions not only of refugee crime, but also crimes by the government. And really, basically, we have done several analyses. This is just one of them, and always you really see a more strongly negative tone on the social media pages. And lastly, and to me most interestingly, we were also able to document behavioral changes of individuals over time. And what we did in this figure now is we analyzed how the posting behaviors of individuals changed depending on how much time they have spent on the AfD Facebook page. And this is now basically we plot the probability or like the number of anti-refugee posts a user on average is posting each week, depending on how many weeks he has been active on this page. And what we observe is this starts off very close to zero, but overall we see this strongly increasing trend. And basically at the end, after basically spending 60 to 100 weeks on this page, the probability, or like in every 2 weeks, usually a user will post some anti-refugee message. And this is at least based in our study, the closest we have actually to documenting some behavioral changes of social media on individuals. Even so, of course, we have to be cautious here as some things are clearly endogenous and we have not made any attempt to identify causality here. So this is all I wanted to present for the case of Germany. And now we can move on to the case study of the US. So again, in case you want to read the full paper, the title is From Hashtag to Hate Crime, Twitter and Anti-Minority Sentiment, again, with the same co-author. And here, again, probably we don't need much motivation. I think everybody of us is familiar that Donald Trump has been heavily criticized for his inflammatory rhetoric on Twitter. And also a lot has been written about the fact that hate crimes have increased in the United States, particularly with a focus on anti-Muslim hate crimes. So here we see an anti-Muslim graffiti on basically the walls of the Islamic Center of America. And again, basically people were concerned that there is this connection. And we basically said, okay, let's bring some data to this concern and see what evidence we can find for such a connection. And we started very similar. Again, we wanted just to look at the time series connection. Does Trump seem to tweet anti-Muslim content very much at the times we see huge spikes in anti-Muslim hate crime in the US? And this basically produced the following graph. And here in this case, the connection is, if anything, even stronger than in the case of Germany. But again, we don't know whether Donald Trump might be reacting to other events that might explain these patterns in both time series. So here in this paper, we also then developed a very different identification strategy. So the idea we had is that Donald Trump basically is tweeting inflammatory tweets, in particular about minority groups, and these are spreading through the Twitter network to his followers. And basically the followers who are then over time and due to this exposure, then are more willing, or basically the people at the fringes might be pushed over the edge to commit hate crimes and even violent acts against minority groups. And basically, given it was the most prominent case, we are going to focus on anti-Muslim hate crime. Again, the concerns would be that, of course, Trump's tweets are endogenous, so he's deciding when he's going to tweet, and also who's deciding to be exposed to Donald Trump's tweets is endogenous, so these people are probably more likely to be from the far right of the political spectrum. To get around these concerns, this paper is not using one but two instruments. So first, we basically use a shock to the adoption of Twitter in the US based on the 2007 South by Southwest Festival. So the idea here is that the 2007 South by Southwest Festival spurred growth in many counties in the US, and even until today left an imprint on the geography of Twitter usage in the US. And we can exploit this variation in Twitter usage, which we argue is unrelated to anything that could explain hate crimes in any basically meaningful way. We can use that to identify the effect of Twitter exposure. And secondly, to basically get at the effect of Donald Trump. Here we are using basically shifts in Donald Trump's behavior based on his presidential schedule. So what we can document is that based on the events that occur in the schedule, the content of Trump's tweets is changing. And given basically that the presidential schedule is to large parts predetermined, we can use this variation to basically say a bit more about the tweets. In the interest of time, I will basically not discuss either of these instruments in large detail, instead just mainly focus on the OLS relationships. But in case you are interested, of course, feel free to read the paper and decide for yourself whether our instruments are able to convince you of these causal impacts of either Donald Trump tweets or of Twitter exposure. So to start with, basically, we have a look at Twitter exposure and hate crime. And just to give you an idea about what we are talking, basically the reason why we focus on anti-Muslim hate crime is that with the start of Donald Trump's presidential run in 2015, we see a near doubling in the number of anti-Muslim hate crimes that occur in the US to close to 300 each year. 300 might not sound as much, but Muslims make up less than 1% of the US population. So even 300 hate crimes each year indicates that at least 1 in 10,000 Muslims becomes a victim of a hate crime. And of course, this is accumulating over the years. So even these numbers are basically significant when it comes to the personal experience of Muslims in the United States. And then basically the first question we asked ourselves was, okay, does now the exposure to Twitter matter for the propagation of anti-Muslim attitudes and hate crime? And here it's a similar idea. If this sentiment is indeed spreading through Twitter, then we should expect this increase in hate crime to be now concentrated in counties with many Twitter users. And this is what we investigate in the following event study graph. So here we look at the changes in hate crime around Donald Trump's presidential run. And while these counties showed very similar trends in hate crime before his presidential run, with the start of Donald Trump's campaign, we now see this uptick in anti-Muslim hate crimes, in counties with many Twitter users, in line with his story. And just basically, of course, this relationship also holds as soon as we introduce our instrument here to basically address concerns about the endogeneity of Twitter usage. We can also show significant upticks in basically anti-Muslim hashtags like Stop Islam or Ban Islam in these counties. So also the online sentiment in these counties have turned more sour for Muslims in these counties. Then the second big question, of course, in everybody's minds is whether Donald Trump himself is contributing to these increases in anti-Muslim hate crimes. Because what I've shown you so far only indicates that his presidential run was associated with this increase, but it does not tell us whether he himself actually caused that or whether there was any other event that might have driven this increase in anti-Muslim sentiment. And here again, we start off very simply, and basically, so we turn the time series graph I showed you in the beginning into regression, and now estimate, do we see, basically, when do we see increases in hate crime around Donald Trump's tweets? And what you can see here is that so Donald Trump's tweets is always at time 0, And on the 2 days afterward, at time 1 and time 2, we see this uptick in anti-Muslim hate crimes in the US. Similarly, we can also show that his anti-Muslim tweets are not only significantly shared throughout the Twitter network over the next days, so this is basically now the retweets of his anti-Muslim content, but we also see that Donald Trump's followers, at least on the day itself, start producing what we call native anti-Muslim content. So these are anti-Muslim tweets that are not retweets of Donald Trump. So people apparently felt encouraged to really produce their own anti-Muslim messaging as well at the time of Donald Trump's tweets. And to give you an idea how much indeed Donald Trump has, to some extent, monopolized the basically supply of anti-Muslim content in the US, or how much people who harbor anti-Muslim sentiment have focused around him had focused around him on the social media platform before his ban. We looked at the hashtag Stop Islam and Ban Islam, and that was too far. And for the around 600,000 tweets that used the hashtag Stop Islam in the US, nearly 500,000 came from Donald Trump's Twitter followers. And the same pattern also holds true for the tweet Ban Islam. So we really see that the people who are willing to tweet such anti-Muslim content are also the ones who are very likely to follow him, and therefore also very likely to basically then read his anti-Muslim messaging. And the last piece of evidence, at least I want to show you here for the US, is then we cannot only look at the time series. So do more anti-Muslim hate crimes now occur on the day after Donald Trump's tweets? And even if I haven't shown you, this relationship also holds when we instrument for his tweets. What we can look at then is also whether the increases in anti-Muslim hate crime after Donald Trump tweets are concentrated in counties with many Twitter users. So again, basically we are now exploiting the panel dimension of our data. And again, similar to what we saw in the time series, you see this spike in anti-Muslim hate crime on the day after Donald Trump's tweets. So this is now a differential change in hate crime on the day after Donald Trump's tweets in counties with many Twitter users. So this is the last main result. And now I just want to spend 1 or 2 minutes talking a bit about the potential mechanism. So in the paper, we have a longer discussion, but the most interesting result to me was indeed when we looked at the complementarity between Twitter usage and pre-existing anti-minority biases. So what we have done in this graph reproduces the event study from the beginning, where it's shown you that counties with many Twitter users are the ones that see an increase in the amount of anti-Muslim hate crime. But now we split these counties by conditional on whether the Southern Poverty Law Center is able to identifies a hate group in that county. And this generates this interesting pattern. So the dashed line with the diamonds at the bottom, which is completely flat, as you can see, indicates that in counties where there are no hate groups, where there's a proxy for anti-minority sentiment, Twitter exposure does not have any differential impact. So that means if there are no hate groups in your county, having higher or low Twitter usage does not make any difference. And basically, we don't see any uptick in the amount of hate crimes. Now, the other line then looks at the counties with hate groups. And what we see here then again is positive effect. And just to be clear about it, this does not only mean, of course, basically we see an uptick in hate crime in counties with hate groups. That's not surprising. What we find is that the uptick in hate crime is stronger in counties with hate groups and with high Twitter usage, really speaking to the complementarity between the two. So it really seems like that people already harbored these pre-existing biases against minority groups, and these then got activated by Donald Trump's presidential run, and particularly the exposure to his anti-minority speech on the social media network Twitter. So this brings me, I think, very much on time to basically the conclusion, or hopefully the transition to our discussion I'm very much looking forward to. So even though I could only basically summarize some of the findings and have skipped quite a few details of our data and about our empirical strategies, you hopefully understand now how we came to the conclusion that there indeed seems to be a connection between the exposure to hateful content online and increase in the occurrence of hate or occurrences of hate crime and against specific minority groups. And it really, overall, our findings suggest that basically it seems to be driven by the activation of politically extreme actors and biases that already predated any of these crises. And so far, at least what we have, we do not have that much evidence for persuasion that really basically large changes in political beliefs. At least in the US, we don't find any evidence for that. And there are also other studies that looked into that and basically were not able to find at least changes at the average population level. And of course, basically given the policy focus of this platform, I of course wanted to brainstorm a bit about solutions, but here also I have to honestly confess that my mind is not yet perfectly made up. Because on the one hand, a solution that often has been suggested is the censorship by social media companies themselves. So we are all aware that Trump has been banned for life from Twitter, and also is banned, I think the ban just got extended for another 2 years from Facebook. Of course, is this a step we should take, that if there are basically speech and actors that basically seem to basically spur this type of content, we simply have to remove them from these platforms. This is very much the way also suggested by the German Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, which fines social media companies if they fail to remove such content. A more milder form of such claims, of course, could go through changes in the social media algorithm, because Facebook, of course, can identify basically critical posts and then just downrank them, so just fewer people see them, which in the most extreme case is equivalent to the censorship. But of course, maybe also like a lot of strategies, given that we see this complementarity between pre-existing biases and social media. Of course, there might also be involved offline de-radicalization, and that we just need to basically convince the people offline and not basically try to tinker around with the exposure online. As of course, any censorship, particularly by non-government, and also in this case by largely unregulated companies, comes as a high price, potentially when it comes to basically future interventions and future exchanges where basically we potentially at some point just open the door for a lot of blanket censorship by anything these social media companies just don't appreciate on their platform. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and basically what we potentially can do about it and what basically our panel thinks about it. And I'm very much thanking you for your attention.
Great, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. Let me offer a few comments based on my particular perspective, which has been working in conflict zones most of my career. I do that on behalf of a strange Swiss organization called the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And we essentially do mediation of peace talks between governments and armed groups. And I am responsible for our work on digital conflict. So when I was asked to be a discussant on this, I thought this is going to be an extremely important and interesting piece of research. And so it has proved, because one of the questions very obviously that people ask in my field is, what is the link between what happens online and offline? And there's, I think, as you've highlighted, Carlo, quite little sort of collated evidence on this, and most of it is anecdotal. So any efforts to draw these more causal relationships, even if it's tenuous, I think are utterly necessary. So what I would say, though, is that when I look at the set of countries which we're engaged in as an organization, the methodological challenges of extending your research are even greater, right? And that's perhaps stating the obvious, but in general, in our field, looking at the relationship between what happens online and what happens offline, there is a heavy concentration of research that is focused more on Europe and the US. But arguably, the greatest threats are posed in those countries which have kind of a fragile political context or already have an ongoing civil war. So I'm colored a little bit by my own experience in Myanmar, where I ran our operations for 7 years, which in many ways is kind of ground zero for what we see happening online against the Rohingya, serving as an amplifier and creating a kind of permissive environment for the Myanmar army to take the action that they did against them, which led to many hundreds of thousands fleeing and many thousands being killed. And I still think as a community, as an academic community, as a community of practitioners, we don't have an established methodology for understanding those links right now. And this is where I think your research begins to move that conversation forward. I think the difficulties in translating it into those other contexts are the obvious ones which all of you would already have thought of in terms of language capacity for a start, and the nuances often when it comes to what we consider to be hate speech. And there, you have some quite good work that's done by specialist organizations in developing a lexicon for hate speech, right? Because, a little bit like some of the hashtags you identified in your research, thinking about what the equivalent would be in some conflict areas. Added to which you obviously have problems of data collection. So as you were presenting, I was thinking to myself, well, what is the equivalent of South by Southwest data in Libya? And do we have an accurate idea of outages in Cameroon? And obviously we don't really have those things. And so, drawing those causal relationships becomes even more difficult. And then the last thing I would say is that, when we consider the potential solutions to it, and I agree with you very much, Carlo, that there's no easy solution to it. And we can maybe examine in the discussion the pros and cons of the different proposals which you outline. There is a general feeling in the Western world that tech companies have too much power, government regulation is necessary, and particularly if you look at kind of from a German perspective on hate speech, there's a long history of an interventionist role there, and arguably with very good reason. But what I would say is that there's a real challenge in translating that to most of the rest of the world, in that, as we know, if we're worried about where to draw the line on free speech in an open society like Germany, you just imagine the challenges in any authoritarian country, because most of where we see kind of these kind of profound hate speech and the most sort of offline violence is in kind of authoritarian settings. There you actually don't want the government to regulate it any more than they're already doing. So pulling that lever is not really an easy option. Pulling the social media platform lever in terms of changing the algorithm is also very hard. This is a kind of policy conversation which we at HD are also engaged in with the platforms, talking to them about how they operate in these conflict zones. But that's just very hard because the amount of resources that they put into these countries is very limited, actually, proportionate to the problem. So no easy solutions. We can get a little bit more into that discussion later on, perhaps, but I'll keep my comments brief, and forgive me for my perhaps slightly different perspective coming from the perspective of more the countries that I've worked in and less from the German and US perspective, but I'm looking mostly at how your research has this kind of potential relevance for other parts of the world.
Great, yeah.
Marina, yes.
Yes, fantastic. Yes, first I want to say thank you so much, Carlo, for the fascinating talk, and also for the opportunity for me to join the discussion. I must say that probably I'll just kind of follow up a little bit with Adam's discussion and comments coming also from sort of peace and conflict research, so to speak, myself. And what I wanted to kind of talk about and mention today is the relation between sort of social media and social media content and collective action, so collective mobilization. So really the key message that really, at least as to me, that emerges from Carlos' fascinating presentation is that social media content can translate into real life actions and decision making. And from the findings, we are kind of seeing also that this old saying of violence begets violence, or kind of hate begets hate, seems to hold. But also, I think also from this research, it's quite evident that social media content is quite important for collective action, and as Adam was suggesting, I think probably we really need to know more, especially in conflict contexts. So the way I've been thinking about social media and social media content is sort of the bright and dark side, so to speak, of social media, which obviously I'm not the first one to do that, but I think it will be helpful for my comment today to kind of distinguish between the two, the bright and dark side of social media and collective action, because social media really is a powerful medium for information, but also disinformation, for organization, coordination, recruitment. But then in terms of collective action, this mobilization that we see, it could adopt different tactics: violent, like assault, the hate crimes that Carlo was talking about, also riots, killings in other parts of the world, but also non-violent, right, such as protests, demonstrations, strikes, and others. And I think another thing that Adam said pretty well resonated with this, how this information can be really used by especially authoritarian regimes to stifle collective action. So in terms of the sort of the dark side that probably Carol really focused on today, I mean, social media can bring a lot of disinformation, extremism, polarization, divisions, as we see in hate speech and violence. And even though Carlo showed us the sort of findings, very interesting findings from the US and Germany, sort of very democratic context, right? In other parts of the world, we see a very different picture. So for instance, so hate speech content has been quite on Facebook, has been posted by military leaders and Buddhist nationalists in Myanmar against the Rohingya minority, which was exactly at the moment of the mass atrocities, ethnic cleansing. So very, very grave sort of real life outcomes. Then also, hate speech on Facebook has been linked to communal violence, such as in Sri Lanka, anti-Muslim riots in 2018, and also armed groups and very, very violent actors like ISIS have used Twitter to recruit members and publicize attack, and that in this way perpetuate violent armed conflict. So these are just some examples, but I think it's quite encouraging to see this evidence that Carlo present to us and think about ways, despite the numerous challenges of applying these ideas and these methodologies to understand better, especially the effect of social media content on offline outcomes. And just briefly, I talked about or discussed a little bit about the dark side, but what about the bright side, right, of social media content? So obviously social media can create the space for diverse opinions, bridging and bringing together wide-ranging audiences that would not normally be able to connect. Give access to information, educational campaigns, countering disinformation as well, and provide a space for a dialogue. And in particular, in terms of mass nonviolent campaigns, so big, large protest movements, right? Social media content has played a very, very important role. For instance, in Tunisia, social media really enabled activists to supersede media censorship, government censorship overall, report on regime repression, and really facilitate all kinds of intergroup collaboration, forming the movement to oust Ben Ali. In Ukraine, in a similar fashion, right? Nowadays they all say that all revolution has a hashtag. So basically, sort of the Euromaidan hashtag Euromaidan protest movement were organizing and coordinating the protest events on social media, and they've used social media to really engage with real-time reporting of the protests. And in violent context, social media content, in social media in general, has provided a medium for people to get information on humanitarian aid, early warning to kind of evade roads where heavy fighting is, for instance, in Liberia. So I think there's a lot of potential also in terms of thinking about peace processes, right? Civil war peace processes, because social media content can provide the space for dialogue, consensus finding, and engaging communities. So overall, I think social media is an amplifier and a connector, people, ideas, and all that. And so I think Carlos showed us that online hate brings offline violence, really. But I would just think, I would encourage you to think really that we can think more about how constructive dialogue online, for instance, can contribute in some way to offline peace.
I have prepared some slides to organize the discussion. So first of all, thanks, Carlo, for the great talk. I am a big fan of Carlo's work. I think this is some of the best evidence we have on the topic. And in particular, just to summarize what Carlo showed us, was first, he has some very convincing evidence that social media or hate speech on social media can have short-term, sort of immediate effects on real-world offline hate crimes. So he has looked at Germany, at the Alternative für Deutschland Facebook page, and has found that posts on this page, so anti-refugee posts on this page, are associated with hate crimes. And this seems to be a causal effect because the relationship essentially breaks down when there are internet outages or Facebook outages in Germany. Second, he has shown us that tweets by Donald Trump that are against Muslims are also in the short term associated with hate crimes against Muslims. Here, this is interpreted as causal because Carlo is able to use variation that comes from the president's schedule. So the direction of causality seems to indeed be from the social media to the real world. And third, and I think also kind of very interestingly, he also has some evidence on the long-term effects of social media, looking at Twitter penetration in the US. And there, the evidence shows that hate crimes, there are more hate crimes in areas with higher Twitter penetration after Trump's candidacy. Again, this is a very convincing causal effect because the variation in Twitter penetration comes from back in time, so back in the early days of Twitter adoption in the US. So that's what we saw. So let me try to discuss a little bit how this fits into the broader literature in economics and in political science that we have on this topic. And in particular, I would like to discuss the possible mechanisms for these effects. Why? Because I think this may matter for the conclusions we would draw regarding policy. So first mechanism, which Marina actually mentioned already, has to do with collective action. So the difference when we think about social media compared to traditional media is that social media facilitates horizontal exchange of information. So this makes it very easy for people to exchange information and to coordinate whether it's for good or for bad. So we have actually quite a lot of evidence that social media matters for protests against authoritarian regimes, as Marina mentioned. And we have both in Carlos' work and in other work evidence that these effects on hate crime seem to be particularly driven by crimes with multiple perpetrators. So that points to this sort of coordination story playing an important role here. A second possible mechanism has to do with persuasion. So second major difference of social media compared to traditional media is that it is very easy to find content that confirms your own views, which in principle can lead to something that people tend to describe as an echo chamber. So imagine someone with who holds views against minorities. It is very easy to find content online on social media that confirms these views and pushes them even further to the extremes. And indeed, we do have some evidence here. It comes from Russia of such an effect. So there is a study that shows that access to social media in Russia appears to increase xenophobic sentiment. And this is particularly true if there is some nationalistic predisposition. Okay, and let me finally mention a third related, but I would put separately this mechanism, which has to do with social norms. So in Carlos' work, we saw that this effect of Twitter in the US appears to kick in after Donald Trump comes into the picture. And one possible interpretation here is that exposure to Trump's anti-minority messaging makes people more comfortable with this kind of, with expressing this type of views, and therefore potentially more willing to act on such views. So here the difference is, of course, that on social media, political actors or celebrities can express their views directly without the sort of gatekeeping role that traditional media usually would have in framing and kind of moderating such messages. Okay, so with that, let me come to the two of the solutions that were mentioned so far. So would censorship work here? So in principle, censorship could help. So mechanically, you could block problematic posts, and this would prevent coordination. So this could prevent this short-term effect of facilitating collective action. You could also, so social media platforms could also block prominent anti-minority users, such as Trump. And in principle, this could prevent the mechanism of deterioration of social norms. And here I want to mention two drawbacks. So first, it is very easy to think of possible backfire effects here. So it is very much possible that, for example, take the block of Trump. It is very easy to imagine that Trump's followers would overcompensate for this by following more and potentially even more extreme content. It is also possible, I am citing here a study on China, where the story is that when one platform, or you can also think of one particular type of content, is censored, users may acquire technology that enables them to circumvent this censorship and therefore get access to even more of the content that was aimed to be censored in the first place. Okay, and second potential drawback is, of course, where to draw the line with censorship. And here, I think, as Adam mentioned, we have both a technological problem in identifying what precisely we should consider as hate speech, but it is also at some level an ethical problem. So where to draw the line of what gets to be censored and what does not. Okay, and second possible solution that was mentioned has to do with algorithms. So the algorithms on social media platforms tend to work in such a way that they feed you like-minded content. Now, reducing this like-minded component in these algorithms could potentially prevent these negative effects of echo chambers. So, in this regard, we have some evidence that indeed, indeed algorithms have a substantial role in what content online users end up consuming. And we also have evidence, in particular from this recent experiment by Levy on Facebook, that providing users with content that comes from the opposing side can actually be very much beneficial. So first finding in this experiment is that people seem to be actually happy to consume opposing content if they are offered that option. So there seems to be in that sense some inertia as opposed to resistance to opposing ideas. And second, the finding in this experiment is that this exposure can actually improve attitudes towards the other side. So there seems to be some scope for intervention here in terms of the algorithms of social media platforms to reduce polarization. Now, I think the evidence is far less scant when it comes to reducing these negative views at the very extremes. So it is not clear whether these findings of this research, of course, a drawback with thinking about changing social media algorithms is that these algorithms are very much optimized to maximize profits of social media companies. So by providing like-minded content, social media platforms draw in their consumers to spend more time on their platforms and therefore increase profits. So this would probably require some very heavy-handed policy or regulatory intervention to achieve a change in algorithms. Okay, let me stop here and thanks a lot.
Wow, fantastic. If you can hear me well, I would like to make a couple of comments. I couldn't possibly even take notes at the speed with which all the discussants and of course Carlo as well were putting forward new ideas. But so I would like to maybe to ask questions on persuasion per se, right? Because on coordination, I would say that access and access to social media can also have, of course, a lot of positive aspects, and sometimes the possibility to coordinate could also be coordination on good causes. Whereas the specific topic of hate crime persuading people to actually commit violence offline is if you wish, the most worrisome of all, because it's definitely only negative. And it's very interesting that the multiple discussants here put it in terms of the pros and cons of censoring, which is basically blocking at the source. But the last proposition, the last point made by Milena is the one about which I know the least, namely what's the best way to do counter messaging, counter persuasion, right? So does it need to be done through algorithm, and what do the algorithms need to pick up? Do they need to pick up specific words in a sort of dictionary on the texts that appear online, or could they be related also to the identification of specific people who have already committed hate crime in the past? So not only selecting text that is particularly hateful that could be countered by countervailing messaging, but also another way to act against a person like a Trump figure, who and an alternative to block him. So it also as an alternative to blocking would be in a sense perhaps also by algorithm to make information appear to the same people that goes in the opposite direction, a sort of equivalent conceptually to fact checking. I wonder whether I understood well where this is going, or whether these are kind of too rough insights or too rough intuitions I got from you, Milena.
Yeah. So I put in my discussion, I try to distinguish between censorship in terms of here I really imagined blocking Trump, for example, or blocking specific posts that imagine explicitly calling for showing up in a particular place at a particular time with the purpose to commit a crime. So here I am thinking really about this social norm dimension and the coordination dimension. Now on algorithms, I think the evidence that we have has to do so far has to do more broadly with polarization and the potential of algorithms for reducing polarization. And I am I don't want to make a statement on how algorithms could play out when it comes to hate crime, simply because I don't think we have good evidence whether this evidence, when it comes to polarization, also translates to the very extremes of the distribution of views, of political views. But yeah, so I think so far we know that, as you put it, this counter messaging, so counter persuasion, if you will, seems to work, and there seems to be scope for that. But whether that also works when it comes to extreme views is, as far as I know, far less clear.
This could also be a good point to bring in Adam again on this issue, right? Because clearly on the field and during a civil war in particular, while the presence of social media could be used for coordination on both sides of a conflict, the role of counter messaging could also be relevant there.
Yes, it's quite a difficult one when you're looking at algorithmic changes and what the platforms call content moderation, right? And what some people call censorship. So there are a number of difficulties. Automating the processes is hard, right? The platforms by and large rely on artificial intelligence because there's only so many kind of fact checkers that they can hire. Even if it's thousands more than before, it's just volume of postings, it's just hard to keep up with it. So they rely on AI, but it's difficult for artificial intelligence. For example, if you were to think of individual words, right, which you might regard as offensive, how do you distinguish between a critical use of that word and a satirical use of that word, right? Someone, for example, criticizing other people using an offensive word, right? AI is not good at distinguishing that. It's also, there's so much of, when it comes to problematic speech online that's nuanced and context dependent, right? And so the idea that you can automate it is quite hard, especially, when you're looking at very different cultures in different languages. So I would say that, yes, we need to engage in that debate and work out how some of these mechanisms within the social media platforms can be strengthened. But I have relatively limited expectations about how much those things will actually change. I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I'm also relatively pessimistic on the effectiveness of counter speech. It's quite a heavy investment in programs like right now. I think it's too early to say whether they work or they don't. But from my observations looking in the field, there's sometimes a kind of utopian quality to some of the messaging which doesn't resonate with people who are predisposed to violence. So I mean, it's just sort of common sense, really. Like if you were to, I'm caricaturing this a little bit, but if you were to talk to people who were considering committing a violent act, telling them that being peaceful is better is not convincing. It doesn't change their behaviors. It doesn't change their attitudes. And again, I'm caricaturing slightly, but I don't think it's that much more sophisticated, most of the programs that I observe. What I do think is kind of, in a way, the next frontier of interventions which have not been tested and which you hint at a little bit, Carlo, in your third recommendation in terms of offline de-radicalization, is what can you do with these people in person, right? Because it's not, all of this is originating, well, not all of it, you do get inauthentic behavior that's generated by trolls, but for the most part, this originates in individuals, right? So to what extent are you able to engage them either in de-radicalization, as you put it, or some discussion around the limits of acceptable behavior, right? And particularly in a context where, as in most conflicts, you have a number of conflict parties, all of whom are engaged in this kind of online battle. Is there a way in which, in my world, I suppose I'm always looking for a negotiated solution to things, right? And so, as a international community, we've got quite good when it comes to actors in armed conflict in identifying how to de-escalate, in determining what is acceptable and not. And we have those codified in things like the Geneva Convention. We do not have an equivalent for behavior online and on social media specifically. So that's a big focus of the work that we're trying to do in defining what does restraint actually mean. If you wanted people to stop doing these things, what terms would you have to agree to in an agreement? What would a digital ceasefire look like, or a social media code of conduct? And we're trying this, right? We tried it in Indonesia in local elections last December, and we're trying it in other countries this year. And it is very hard, but I come from a biased perspective, but my hope is that by engaging with those who are responsible for some of this negative online speech, we can work out ways to sort of try to, if not stop the problem at source, try to limit it somewhat.
I think one thing I wanted to ask you about, Adam, also was because you brought up the idea of like hate speech lexicons, because like even in my own research, I constantly face the problem, what is actually hate speech? Like in these two projects I presented today was pretty like, we just tagged it also based on some dictionary, but there basically we had the advantage that most of the content was negative, so we didn't have to do that much filtering. But of course, if we want to do it at the actual level of an entire social media network, this becomes very difficult. So basically, what's your intuition? Basically, how far? Basically, do we have any good definition of hate speech? Basically, how successful are these hate speech lexicons? Because like, yeah, if you ask 3 people, you probably get 4 different definitions of hate speech, especially if you just show individual posts, people probably
Yeah. So I think that, again, we don't have a very large evidence base because these lexicons have only been developed in a few countries. They've tried it in Kenya, they've tried it in a few other places. I think what's more important than the sort of the list of words, if you will, right, is the process which you follow to get to that list. Precisely because, as you say, if you ask 4 people are going to have different definitions. So you need to have some kind of process by which you have some rough consensus, right? So that might be amongst, you know, a group of a dozen leading civil society organizations who've been working on these issues in the country. It might be, if you're concerned about hate speech from political parties, bringing together those political parties and sharing what, say, a civil society group has developed and seeing where they concur. But the short of it is that you need to have a negotiated process by which people come to a rough common understanding on those things. Because if we just sort of sit as in an expert community and kind of draw up the list of things that we consider hate speech, well, you know, has this sort of no political commitment from those who are actually responsible for those things. So that's how we would go about it. But I can't give you many examples of countries where it's been wildly successful because it's not been tested very heavily yet.
No, because basically it just came to my mind because Milena obviously has like this fascinating work on how just change, like of course, again, in the US context where we basically, it's just basically, the context, usually a lot of research is done because the data are there, and also basically a lot of European researchers have just more country expertise. But like for Milena's work, we know that just changing simple words like in messaging can be very successful. Maybe, Milena, if you want to say anything about it, really, like, because I was wondering, given if we could agree on like, some words should not be used, then of course, if it just comes down to individual terms in the lexicon, whether like, basically on the one hand, if you get enough people, basically influential people on social media to agree to it, or basically just the social media company just to replace them with a different term, maybe that would be like a light touch intervention in opposed to anything basically with these chyrons or censorship, basically that might be effective.
Can I ask the kind of most controversial question of them all, maybe to all 4 speakers? So what would you do if you were Twitter? Would you invite Donald Trump back, or would you keep him on the sidelines? So what's your view on that, collectively speaking?
Maybe to start, I have to say it was the ban of Donald Trump from Twitter, at least so far, seems to have been surprisingly successful, I would say. Like, I think the Biden presidency now, after 5 months, would look very different if he was still tweeting from the sidelines. Of course, again, basically, we have a sample size of 1. There's no counterfactual analysis, but in this particular case, I think the ban is at least justifiable. And of course, I'm not a Twitter executive, but after the events in January, basically, I think I might have come to the similar conclusion.
Yes.
Yeah, so Adam is saying the same thing. You're just saying yes, right?
I think that my take on this is that so far the platforms have had a rule where they exempt not just Trump, but all political leaders, essentially. I don't think it's a very good idea to give carte blanche to political leaders just because they're political leaders. And you see actually a formal shift in policy change from the platforms, which was announced, I think, in a couple of weeks ago, which basically said that exemption will cease to apply. I think that's a wise thing. I think just what everyone is generally looking for is consistency and understanding. And in general, you know, the US is obviously one example, but there are so many more where essentially the main lever by which sort of the people trying to pull to influence platforms is bad headlines. And that is not a very thoughtful way to deal with profoundly important issues that affect society, and at worst can lead to the loss of people's lives. And I saw on Twitter someone that they did a little GIF of people who of how they conceived of platforms making their policy, and it's like people laying down a track in front of a train as the train is running, right? That's how it feels a lot of the time. And I think that you know, what people expect and what is required is fairly strict rules, I would say, and for them to be consistently enforced regardless of your political status.
So Marina and Milena, what's your stake on that?
So I agree with, I have to agree with what Carlos said. I think we have seen probably some positive effects. I would, however, be, as I mentioned in my talk, I would be very much worried about potential backfire effects of the ban. So I think so far it has been relatively short time. We may have not seen much of that, but in the long run, I could imagine potentially Trump's followers becoming even more radicalized by following similar or even more extreme accounts, or simply by feeling like a victim in the popular space because their favorite politician and representative in that sense does not have a platform.
Yes, I pretty much agree with everything that's been said, and it's especially if I can pick up on the comment of the backfiring effect that Milan just mentioned. I mean, obviously Trump has been exhibiting a lot of authoritarian tendencies, right? And you know, this negative othering, and one of the things that could be that he might be in a way, even if banned from social media, kind of delegating or somehow finding alternative channels to raise supporters to kind of carry out his acts on the ground, and for people who are not entirely banned from this kind of social media. So what I was trying to say is that, yes, this ban seems for now to be quite successful, I think, but I will always be cautious about finding, you know, alternative channels or leeways for which from this kind of individuals to exert influence on.
We're thanks so much. There is one question that I got in this chat by Clémence Tricot. So Clémence, the floor is yours with your question.
Hi, thank you so much. So I try to be brief, or almost out of time, but I just wanted to ask about the relationship between online and traditional media. So Carlo, I really liked the comparison you did in Germany between the content on Facebook and the one on media. But then related perhaps to Milena's discussion, I feel that perhaps the right comparison is not to look at all newspapers, but at newspapers that share similar view as the AFD, because then you would compare, you know, similar echo chambers. And I think that would be interesting to compare the content, not of all newspapers, but on those that are more likely similar in views to the AFD. And I was also wondering how you think about the outreach of the two medias, because that the AFD might, you know, people looking at those Facebook group might be very specific, whereas people reading newspapers might be more at large. And so I was wondering how you think about this, and also whether you could do a kind of horse race exercise between the two type of media. So it might be less causally identified, but now that you have shown that there is a causal link of Twitter, you can just do an event study after a Twitter or after a Facebook post versus an even study after a newspaper article emphasizing like violence by Muslims or by refugees. And also, again, on the interplay between the two, how much you think Twitter or Facebook is actually shaping the content of traditional media. So there is some research by Katia and Julia Cagé about this. And so it might not be only the direct effect of Twitter and Facebook, but also through how it affects the content of traditional media.
I think these are all very interesting points. Basically, maybe just to answer them briefly, and basically, if you have further questions, I'm happy to discuss them further by email. So the interesting thing is, in Germany, there is no mainstream outlet that has basically similar extreme points to the AfD. You would have to go to very niche newspapers that maybe sell like maybe a few thousand issues, while the AfD's page reaches probably millions of people. So I think this is really the difference we see in the social media platform that has moved things to the mainstream. We can look at right-wing outlets, but even there we would see the differences. When it comes to horse races, we actually have done something in our paper on the US where we compare basically because we can also there, we have some evidence that Trump's tweets spill over onto more coverage in these media platforms. But there we can actually do a horse race. So whether exposure to Twitter or exposure to Fox News at the county level matters. And the effect of Twitter seems to be by far more important in magnitude. But of course, this is only preliminary. And basically, it's really interesting to really see this interplay between these two media platforms. But I think we are only at the beginning there. And like it's often hard to identify stuff at actually the country level. Certainly very interesting questions. And maybe in some future research project, might be able to shed more light on this, but that's what we have so far.
So one thing I guess we won't have time, but one thing I find a really intriguing question is Milena's point on the algorithm, right? I think, you know, if you could pass a law that would force the companies to avoid these algorithms that kind of create echo chambers, then I think that would be kind of very interesting. The problem is this is so complex that how would you do that? And they would have so many incentives to circumvent this law because that's how they make their money, right? But it's kind of I guess this could make a huge difference, right? Because like if you I mean 10 years ago, if you've asked yourself, is all this online media stuff, is that a force of good or of bad? I would have said, oh, Wikipedia, it's so amazing. You have all this knowledge at your hands. You can access it in 2 seconds. And now I see, you know, my kids watching grumpy cat videos on YouTube all day like idiots. So it's kind of, you know, I have the impression that internet is kind of used, is put to foul use. And so by kind of having less of these addictive algorithms and echo chamber favoring algorithms, you could kind of make a positive difference. But how to do it in a way that's kind of, you know, enforceable, it's hard.
It's going to be a topic for...
Yeah.
Maybe a topic for a continuation of this very interesting discussion that already gave us. And I would also like to imagine that in the future there could be research and evidence also about the power of backfiring, because clearly the recent lower success of AfD in Germany could also be related, but we don't know. We don't have research telling us whether it's causally related or not, to potentially people having realized that perhaps hate speeches led to too much offline violence, such that some people have retracted their support for them, right? So that's so the counter causation would be something to study as well.
Yeah, at least in the US, just to teaser more of my research. Basically, at least in the US, we have some evidence now that at least Twitter exposure basically harmed Trump's electoral chances as well, if you look at the average population. So there might very well be countervailing effects, and maybe we just have to meet in a few years again, and also then we can also reevaluate the Trump ban on Twitter and see how it will look in hindsight.
Yes. Well, thanks all of you. This has been incredibly informative for me and hopefully for the others as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. It was really a fantastic peace talk today.
It was great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marina. Thanks, Milena.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
It was very
So much.
Thank you.